The courtroom doors eased open, and a hush rolled through the gallery. 17-year-old Corey Johnson stepped inside, wrists shackled, chin lifted, wearing a smirk that didn't belong in a place like this. He glanced at the rows of victims' families, the reporters, the officers. Almost as if their pain, their fear, their hope for justice were nothing more than an audience he'd been waiting to perform for. The judge followed him with her eyes, studying every step he took. A mother in the front row gripped a tissue so tightly her knuckles whitened. And beside Corey, his attorney leaned in and whispered, barely above a breath, "Corey, not now." But Corey didn't look away from the courtroom gallery. That smirk stayed. That confidence stayed. As if he believed none of this could touch him. A teenager who thought he had the justice system figured out was about to learn how wrong he was. And just as the judge prepared to speak, the entire room held its breath. The prosecutor rose from the table and gave a simple nod towards the screen. A cue the entire courtroom understood. The lights dimmed, shadows stretching across the floor as the monitor flickered awake. Corey leaned back in his chair as if settling in for entertainment, not evidence. Another smirk finding its way onto his face, steady and sure, as though nothing shown here could possibly harm him. What happened next would expose every lie Corey ever told. The screen froze on a single frame from his interrogation. Corey Johnson, sitting across from detectives, smiling while they described the fear in the victim's eyes. A mother in the gallery pressed her hand to her mouth, trying to hold herself together. One of the jurors shifted, uncomfortable, shaken by what that still frame revealed. And Corey didn't blink. In that moment, the courtroom saw the truth. That image shattered the defense's narrative. If you're watching this and you want more deep, real courtroom stories just like this one, make sure you like the video, subscribe for future updates, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your support helps us bring these powerful cases to light. Before that still frame appeared on the screen, Corey Johnson was just a name in a caption and a face at the defense table. To understand why that one image hit so hard, you have to know who he was, and what he did before he ever set foot in that courtroom. Corey was 17 years old when everything happened. A Florida kid from Palm Beach County, living in the kind of suburban community most families move to because it feels safe, stable, normal. Teachers and adults around him would later describe him as smart, even gifted in some areas, but drifting. A bright kid losing direction. He wasn't the class clown, and he wasn't invisible either. He lived in that middle space, quiet enough to be overlooked, restless enough that people noticed when his attitude started to change. At home and at school, his behavior began to shift. Mood swings, anger, long stretches online, moments where teenage bravado covered something more volatile underneath. A psychologist would eventually testify that Corey was on the autism spectrum and struggling with the death of his abusive father, details that added layers to his story, but didn't erase what he chose to do. In the years before the attack, investigators say Corey became obsessed with extremist content, consuming propaganda and materials linked to ISIS. Court records and reporting later revealed that federal authorities had even been aware of him, monitoring some of his online activity before this case exploded into national news. But on the night that changed everything, none of that was visible from the outside. From the outside, it looked like a normal sleepover. It was March 12, 2018, in Palm Beach Gardens, Florida. A birthday gathering at a home inside the Ballon Isles Country Club, one of those gated developments with manicured lawns, trimmed hedges, and security at the entrance. A place where parents feel comfortable letting their kids spend the night, because nothing like that ever happens there. Inside the house, 3 boys were supposed to be doing what teenagers do at sleepovers, eating, laughing, staying up way too late. 13-year-old Giovanni Sierra was the guest of honor. It was his birthday. He was the kid most parents describe with simple words that hurt even more after they're gone. Funny, kind, full of life. He was staying at the home of his best friend, then 13-year-old Dane Bancroft. Upstairs and downstairs, there were signs of normal teenage life. Game controllers, snacks, cell phones lit up with notifications. Corey Johnson was there too. He wasn't Giovanni's longtime friend. He'd been invited by Dane's older brother, Kyle, who was 15 at the time. That connection brought Corey into the house, into that bedroom, and into the middle of a night that would never be forgotten. What followed wasn't a fight that got out of hand. It wasn't a moment of teenage recklessness that could be walked back the next morning. According to police and prosecutors, Corey waited until the house was quiet, until the boys were sleeping, and then he attacked, stabbing 3 people in that home, killing 13-year-old Giovanni and critically injuring Dane and his mother, Elaine Simon, as they tried to protect him. For responders and neighbors, the scene that morning was the kind you don't ever forget. An upscale neighborhood, flashing lights cutting through dawn, officers and paramedics rushing in and out of a house where, hours earlier, kids had been celebrating a birthday. As police began to piece together what happened, they heard 2 very different threads. On one hand, survivors and witnesses describing chaos, fear, and desperate attempts to stop the violence. On the other hand, Corey's own statements, cold, direct, and tethered to his anger over comments he claimed were disrespectful to his faith. He was arrested that same day. A teenager in handcuffs, taken from a crime scene that looked nothing like the kind of place people imagine when they picture a homicide investigation. From there came the first interviews, the first interrogations, and the start of a paper trail that would eventually stretch from local police reports all the way to federal interest in his radicalization. Over the next few years, the case moved through the system. Charges were filed: first-degree murder for the death of Giovanni Sierra and attempted murder for the brutal injuries inflicted on Dane and his mother. Psych evaluations were ordered. Experts were brought in. Juries were selected, hearings scheduled, motions argued. In West Palm Beach, this wasn't just another case on a docket. Local stations covered every major development. Reporters stood on courthouse steps, summarizing new filings and emotional hearings. Community members watched the story unfold, stunned that a radicalization case, a sleepover murder, and a teenager from their area were now tied together in one headline. By the time Corey Johnson walked into that courtroom years later, older now, but still with the same defiant posture, it wasn't just about what happened in that bedroom back in 2018, it was about all of it. The crime, the arrest, the long hours of interrogation where detectives tried to understand how a birthday party turned into a crime scene, the expert testimony about his mind, his beliefs, his choices, and the weight of an entire community waiting to see whether the justice system would meet the moment. Parents who lived in similar neighborhoods watched this case closely, thinking about their own kids' sleepovers, their own trust in safe spaces. Friends of the victims replayed that night over and over in their heads. And inside the courtroom, every person sitting in those wooden benches was carrying a version of the same question. How does a 17-year-old boy end up here, facing life in prison for what he did in a house where he was welcomed as a guest? This wasn't just a crime. It was a community shaken to its core. In a courtroom like this, stories aren't told with imagination. They're told with records, reports, and the people who almost didn't live long enough to sit in that witness chair. The first wave of evidence came not from detectives or analysts, but from hospitals. Jurors listened as medical professionals described what they saw in the early hours of March 12, 2018, when victims from a Palm Beach Gardens sleepover were rushed into their care. A 13-year-old boy, Giovanni Sierra, brought in with multiple stab wounds after what was supposed to be a birthday night. Another 13-year-old, Dane, his body marked by more than 30 stab wounds. His mother, Elaine, stabbed again and again in her own home as she tried to shield her child. The doctor's voice in court was steady, clinical, but the details never lost their human weight. They spoke of how Giovanni's injuries were so severe, so extensive, there was nothing more they could do. They explained the attempts to stabilize him, the efforts to keep his heart working, the heartbreak of knowing, even with all their training and all their equipment, they were too late. Then they turned to Dane and Elaine. Jurors heard how Dane was stabbed over and over, 30+ wounds tearing through his small frame. Yet he somehow survived. They heard about Elaine's injuries, how she suffered deep wounds while fighting to reach her son, while trying to stop an attack from a teenager she had allowed into her home as a guest. The doctor described blood loss, organ damage, and the long road back, surgeries, rehabilitation, pain that lingered well beyond the night of the attack. This wasn't a quick fix or a "they're okay now" moment. It was months and years of recovery, physically and emotionally. And then came the quiet, powerful turn. In careful words, the medical testimony made it clear, by any ordinary expectation, Dane and his mother might not have survived. Being stabbed that many times in that fashion usually doesn't end with a patient sitting up, walking out, and later taking the stand in a courtroom. The fact that they did survive meant something crucial for this trial. It meant they could look at that defense table. It meant they could say, under oath, who did this to them. It meant Corey Johnson's actions would not be filtered only through reports and second-hand accounts. They would be told by the people who felt every blow. That was the first layer, the human cost laid bare through medical evidence. Then the room shifted as the state moved to the next layer, the police evidence. Jurors were taken back to that morning, not in memory, but through the eyes and ears of the first responders. They heard the 911 calls, panicked voices, pleas for help, the sounds of chaos in the background. They saw what officers saw when they entered the quiet, gated community of Ballon Isles and stepped into a house that no longer matched its surroundings. In court, investigators walked everyone through a reconstructed version of the crime scene, where Giovanni had been found, where Dane collapsed, where Elaine fought for her life, where the knife was recovered. They laid out photographs, diagrams, and measurements. Every room was mapped. Every trace of blood was connected to a moment in time. Every step Corey took inside that house after the others went to sleep was charted for the jury. From there, prosecutors moved into the timeline. They showed when messages stopped being answered, when neighbors heard sounds they couldn't quite place, when the first emergency call came in, when officers arrived at the front door of a home that had seemed completely ordinary just hours before. The story the defense wanted to suggest: confused teen, a sudden break from reality, an act with no clear awareness, was put side by side with hard time stamps, with phone data, with interviews, with Corey's own words. Because Corey had talked, he spoke to detectives after the attack. He told them why he did what he did, saying he felt offended by comments about his faith, saying he believed the younger boy's words were disrespectful and that his actions were somehow justified. He admitted to reading from religious text on his phone just before the stabbing, claiming it gave him courage to carry out what he had planned.
It is day 2 of the murder trial for a 21-year-old
But when investigators
Corey Johnson,
overlaid his explanation with the timeline and the physical evidence, things didn't line up the way Corey wanted them to. He spoke as if events moved quickly, as if there was confusion and chaos from the moment he felt offended to the moment of violence. The evidence suggested something else: time passing, decisions being made, steps taken through a dark house, a series of deliberate choices, not a single instant of lost control. He minimized what he had done. The number of wounds showed otherwise. He framed it as a sudden reaction. The positioning of victims and the sequence of injuries suggested planning. He tried to explain his motives as a kind of twisted defense of his beliefs. The timeline showed opportunities to stop, to walk away, to choose anything else. Piece by piece, the police evidence didn't just tell jurors what happened. It quietly, steadily pulled apart Corey's version of that night. From the hospital records to the floor plans, from the officer's arrival to Corey's own recorded words, one thing became harder and harder to ignore. The story he wanted people to believe could not stand up next to the story the evidence told. Then came the digital trail, the part of the investigation no teenager ever seems to think adults will check. Detectives pulled Corey's search history from the night before the attack and the early hours leading up to it. Searches about violent acts, searches about motivations, searches that suggested he wasn't acting in a moment of confusion, but in a moment of preparation. There were messages, too. Short, strange exchanges with peers that hinted at something he didn't have the courage to say directly. Words that carried a tone of thrill-seeking, a tone that felt out of place for someone claiming panic or sudden loss of control. Investigators showed screenshots of social media posts where Corey tried to project himself as tougher, colder, more fearless than the boy his teachers once saw struggling in class. A teenager building an image online, calculated, exaggerated, and far from the quiet kid adults used to know. And then the twist that made the courtroom shift in their seats. Corey had bragged online, hours before the incident, not about the attack itself, but about being ready to show something, about proving himself, about stepping into a role he believed made him powerful. The room didn't need more explanation. This wasn't impulsive. This wasn't heat-of-the-moment rage. This was a boy preparing for the attention he thought he'd get afterward. But the prosecution wasn't done. Next came the behavioral evidence, the moments that, in hindsight, adults wished they hadn't ignored. Former teachers recalled outbursts in school, sudden anger, mocking comments, reactions that seemed too intense for the situation. Nothing that got him expelled, nothing that triggered a major intervention, just enough to worry teachers, but not enough to pull him out of the system for deeper evaluation. Classmates had once mentioned threats, things he said in passing, moments brushed off as, "he's just being edgy," or typical teen attitude. Warnings that, at the time, felt like exaggerations or attempts at attention. Warnings that landed differently now that jurors knew what he was capable of. And then there were the police interviews, the ones the courtroom saw earlier on video. Corey sitting back, arms crossed, emotionless. Detectives telling him about the victim's terror, yet seeing no sign of regret. Not in his words, not in his expression, not even in the way he held himself across the table. And just when the jury thought they had seen all of it, the prosecution replayed a single, brief moment from the interrogation, one that some viewers might have missed the first time. Corey laughed. Not long, not loudly, but enough for detectives to pause, enough for the courtroom to recoil, enough to remind everyone that remorse was never part of his story. Each layer tightened around him. The searches, the posts, the behavior, the reactions, forming a picture no smirk in the world could hide from. And now, the courtroom had reached the moment when that picture would meet its consequences. As the final pieces of digital and behavioral evidence settled over the courtroom, the silence that followed carried more weight than any argument either side could make. In the first row, the victims' families sat shoulder to shoulder. Some cried quietly, trying to stay composed in a place where every detail felt like a wound reopening. One mother kept her eyes fixed on Corey, searching his face for the slightest sign of regret, some flicker that he understood what he had taken from her. But her hands trembled in her lap, because every time she looked, she saw nothing. Behind them, classmates who had known Corey before any of this sat stunned. Teenagers who once shared classrooms and hallways with him whispered to each other, replaying memories that now felt different, heavier. Neighbors from Palm Beach Gardens, people who had lived just a few streets away, shook their heads as they recalled how quickly Corey had changed, how a kid they once waved to seemed to shift into someone they no longer recognized. Police officers who had responded that night watched from the side of the courtroom. One leaned toward a reporter and said quietly, "I've seen fear. I didn't see any in Corey." His words weren't dramatic. They were observational, measured, coming from someone who had spent years reading faces at crime scenes. And scattered across the gallery, courtroom spectators reacted in ways they couldn't hide. A woman gasped softly during the replay of Corey's interrogation smile. A man folded his arms and shook his head in disbelief, reacting not only to what Corey had done, but to the calmness with which he had described it afterward. Some stared down at their feet. Others wiped their eyes. Everyone seemed to carry the same weight, a mixture of sorrow, anger, and disbelief, that a night meant for celebration had turned into this. This case wasn't just evidence on paper. It was pain on every face in that courtroom. When detectives first questioned Corey in the hours after the attack, his words came out casual, almost careless. He sat slouched in the chair, offering short explanations, brushing off details that would later become central to the case. "I didn't mean for anything to happen. It wasn't that serious." He shrugged when officers pressed him. He laughed at moments no one else found remotely appropriate. He acted as if the night had gotten slightly out of hand. Nothing more. A teenager minimizing a horror he had created. But months later, as the case moved through hearings, depositions, and mental evaluations, Corey's tone shifted. Gone were the smirks and the quick dismissals. Suddenly he appeared emotional during interviews. He said he'd been confused. He spoke about fear, his own fear, as though it explained everything. He denied ever taking pleasure in the violence, denied the coldness that investigators captured on video. He tried to present himself as misunderstood, overwhelmed, a young man swallowed by circumstances he couldn't fully grasp. Yet the evidence told a very different story. The courtroom had already seen Corey smiling during the interrogation, that unsettling grin, while detectives described the terror on his victims' faces. They had seen the messages he sent before the attack. Confident, charged, seeking attention. They saw the searches he made, the posts he created, the preparation that contradicted every claim of sudden panic or confusion. And when prosecutors compared his recorded statements to the testimony he now offered, the contradictions weren't small. They were glaring. They were structural. They revealed calculation where Corey claimed chaos, deliberation where he insisted there was fear, intent where he wanted the jury to see a moment of emotional collapse. Piece by piece, his story fractured. With every contradiction, Corey's mask cracked. But he continued to pretend he was in control, to understand why Corey reacted the way he did. In the interrogation room, in the courtroom, and even in the moments leading up to the attack, investigators and psychologists had to look beyond the crime itself and into the mindset that shaped him long before that night. Corey was a teenager who moved through life as if consequences were optional, as if rules applied to everyone else but somehow stopped at his feet. He carried himself with an air of untouchability, not because he had earned respect or authority, but because he believed performance and bravado were enough to create the illusion of both. His identity wasn't built on real relationships or genuine confidence. It was built on reactions, the attention he could draw, the control he thought he had over how people viewed him. Experts later described traits that painted a clearer picture. A manipulative streak that let him shift stories depending on who was listening. A deep concern about image, not reputation rooted in values, but the mask he could craft for others. A lack of empathy that made other people's fear, pain, and safety feel distant, secondary, almost irrelevant to him. And above all, a belief that attention, any attention, elevated him. Corey mistook being noticed for being powerful, and entitlement played a major role in that. He believed his age protected him, that his status as a juvenile gave him a cushion adults wouldn't dare look past. He believed his smirks, his charm, his calm demeanor would sway those in authority. Police officers, attorneys, even a judge. He believed that showing emotion wasn't necessary because he had learned long ago how to mask it, how to fold it away when he didn't want people to see what was underneath. That kind of emotional control doesn't appear out of nowhere. Corey came from a home marked by instability, environments where steady guidance was often out of reach. There were reports of emotional neglect, not always intentional, but impactful all the same. Moments when adults in his life were distracted, overwhelmed, or simply unavailable. Moments when accountability was never modeled, never taught, never enforced. A child who never sees consequences grows into a teen who doesn't believe they apply to him. A child who learns to hide emotions grows into someone who weaponizes the absence of them. And a child who watches chaos become normal grows into someone who mistakes control for power. So when Corey walked into that courtroom smirking, when he sat in that interrogation room smiling, it wasn't confidence, it wasn't misunderstanding, it wasn't fear. It was the only version of control he thought he had left. Corey didn't fear the law, he feared losing the illusion of power. The courtroom had been heavy all morning, but when the judge finally lifted her eyes from the bench and called Corey Johnson forward, the air changed entirely. Corey stood slowly, shackles clinking, and that familiar smirk crept back onto his face, the same one he'd worn during his interrogation, the same one he wore when he first walked through those courtroom doors. His attorney leaned in, voice barely above a whisper. "Corey, stop." But he didn't. Not at first. He stepped toward the podium with the swagger of someone who believed the moment still belonged to him. But this time, the courtroom wasn't watching him perform. They were waiting for the judge. The room went silent, a silence so deep that the microphones picked up the sound of breathing. Victims' families leaned forward instinctively, bracing themselves. Court staff froze. Even Corey shifted his weight, the smirk tightening just slightly, as if he sensed the performance was nearing its end. And then the judge began to speak. Her tone wasn't harsh, wasn't raised, wasn't emotional in the way the families were. It was steady, measured. A voice that carried the authority of someone who had spent decades deciding what society must accept and what it cannot. She spoke first about responsibility, about what it means to take a life, to change the course of families forever, to bring fear into a community that trusted their children would be safe. She reminded the courtroom that these were not abstract tragedies. These were people with birthdays, with futures, with voices that would never be heard in that room again. Then she turned to consequences, emphasizing that age does not erase accountability. She acknowledged that Corey was young, but so were the victims, and their age had not protected them. She explained that the justice system does not exist to excuse harm, but to confront it, even when the person responsible is 17. She spoke of the moral weight of choices, the choices Corey made before, during, and after the attack, the choices he had to prepare, the choices he had to carry out, the choices he had to explain with a smile when detectives asked him what happened. And finally, she spoke about society's duty to protect victims. That the law is not simply a rule book. It is a shield, one that must be lifted when families, children, and communities are harmed. With each word, something shifted in Corey. At first, it was barely noticeable. The smirk faltered, not disappeared, just weakened, like a performer forgetting his lines. His jaw unclenched. His eyes drifted down, no longer holding that defiant stare. Color began to drain from his face, and his breathing tightened, shallow, uneven, as if his body suddenly realized what his mind was trying to outrun. The judge paused, letting the silence settle one final time before reading the sentencing range. The years, the weight, the full reality of what Corey would now face. The courtroom reacted instantly. The camera cut to the victims' families, tears streaming, hands clasped, relief mixing with grief so raw it almost seemed to echo off the walls. A mother cried into her sleeve, shaking uncontrollably. Another parent nodded, eyes closed, whispering a quiet thank you that justice had finally found its way into the room. Corey did not react at first. He stared forward, his eyes unfocused, the smirk gone entirely now, replaced by something he had spent years hiding. Fear. Real fear. Not the kind he claimed after the fact, not the confusion he tried to portray, but the recognition that the world he thought he controlled had slipped out of his hands forever. For the first time, Corey Johnson looked less like the untouchable teenager he pretended to be, and more like someone who finally understood that actions have consequences, no matter how tightly you cling to the illusion of power. In those final seconds, Corey Johnson finally understood. The deputies took hold of Corey's arms, guiding him away from the podium and towards the exit. There was no smirk now, no swagger, no trace of the confidence he'd worn like armor when he first entered the courtroom. He walked with his head lowered, the weight of the sentence settling onto his shoulders with every step he took. Families watched him go, some in tears, some in silence, all carrying their own version of closure. Just before he reached the door, Corey slowed. He turned his head slightly and looked back. Not at the judge, not at the victims' families, not at the investigators who had unraveled every piece of his story. He looked at the empty chair he had been sitting in hours earlier, the chair where he smirked, the chair where he believed the moment belonged to him, the chair where he thought control was still in his hands. Was this the moment Corey changed, or simply the moment he realized he had nowhere left to hide? In the end, the smirk that once defined him was the last thing the court took away. If this story moved you, or if you want to follow more true courtroom moments where truth meets accountability, make sure you like the video, subscribe for more updates, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice helps keep these stories alive and reminds us why justice matters.